Dialectical Materialism versus the New Physics. And it's published by New Vista Publishers, if any of you are interested to get information on that.
It's on Amazon.com.
Yes. A little about Mike. He's a member of the May 1st Coalition for Workers and Immigrant Rights. He's the chair, Local 375, AFSCME, Labor Community Unity Committee. Retired executive board member of Local 375 and delegate to the New York City Central Labor Council from Local 375. Former consultant on player evaluation as an advisor to the general managers of Major League Baseball teams. He has written baseball player and team evaluation books and has been a speaker at a number of Society on American Baseball Research, SABR, conferences. Does statistical analysis of the unemployment figures published by the Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which he emails widely. Author of the book that I just showed you, Dialectical Materialism versus the New Physics. And above all, he's a red diaper baby from the 40s who never stopped fighting for a better world. Mike Gimbel. Second, our next presenter is, and someone was just looking at the books on that table, that chair right there, but I'll mention it as we go along. Glenn Borchardt, PhD. He's the director, Progressive Science Institute, Berkeley, California. Glenn has 50 years of practical and theoretical experience in earth science. He has produced over 300 scientific reports, including journal articles, book material, and computer programs. He's the author of The Scientific Worldview and the 10 Assumptions of Science. Let me just hold it up so at least you could see. And Universal Cycle Theory. This is a little heavy, so I had to hold it separately. I'd like to ask that Mike Gimbel will present first, followed by Glenn, and then we will have a session for question and answers. Mike Gimbel.
Thank you, Chuck. Before I speak, I am a strong supporter of Workers' World Party. However, I am not a member of Workers' World Party. Therefore, what I say today should not be construed as the political position of Workers' World Party. What you hear today is completely my own opinion. I have been a lifelong communist, and I was shocked about 30 years ago to discover that today's physics is dominated by idealist and even religious thinking. I discovered that mathematics had improperly invaded and taken over physics and was being used to attack materialism. Why is this panel necessary for Marxists? Well, we all have imagination. Our imagination is useful in explaining the world we live in. The historical struggle between materialism and idealism is the struggle of science versus religion. Our imagination historically was dominated by the ghosts and angels and gods and devils and heaven and hell, and above all, of souls that can separate themselves from the body. And numbers like 666 were magical things. These were the ways that more primitive humans tried to explain the world as it existed. Today's more sophisticated humans are subjected to scientifically sounding nonsense that ignores real science and misuses the concept of infinity. Nonsense such as something called space-time, that is the product of math, not of observation. Time and space are merely the coordinates that we use to measure the motion of matter in relation to the motion of other matter. Nothing more. Time and space are not matter, nor a dimension of matter. Nonsensical beliefs about living in multi-dimensions and parallel universes, in curved space, in warp space, and in more wormholes and loops and knots in this magical space-time. Nonsensical belief in black holes, in the Big Bang, and in time travel. Nonsensical belief in the beginning and an end of time and space. Nonsensical belief in energy separate from matter, just like the soul separated from the body. Nonsensical belief in spheres with zero radius, or a point of zero size, or of objects with infinite density. Actual spheres cannot have a zero radius. Please show me that sphere. You can't do it. Infinite density is a misuse of the concept of infinity. Infinity is not a number. There is no such thing as infinite density. There's no such thing as infinite temperature or zero size. It is said that matter crosses the event horizon of a black hole cannot escape. That matter ends up in an infinitely dense singularity that increases the mass of the black hole. You cannot increase nor decrease the infinite. This violates basic math. This is mathematical illiteracy. Nonsensical belief in contradictory concepts such as massless particles and point particles. If a particle exists, it must have mass and it must be measurable in 3 dimensions. Nonsensical belief that there was an initial state of the universe, which is nothing more than the old religious belief in a God creating the universe. It is creationism in scientific garb. Nonsensical belief that mathematics could describe the mythical initial state of the universe. Nonsensical belief that the universe is a physical object that is expanding. Nonsensical belief in action at a distance, which is nothing more than belief in action without a cause. A violation of the most important law of physics, which is causality. Action at a distance is an appeal to magic, not to science. Unfortunately, this nonsense has become accepted as good science and is taught to breathless youths at the highest universities by men and women who are looked up to as almost godlike in their knowledge. This nonsense has become the Church of Relativity with a god named Einstein. The fight against the Church of Relativity is the modern struggle of science versus religion, of materialism versus idealism. This panel is a modest attempt at throwing the light of reality on this newest form of mysticism. This panel will link this fight for science with the class struggle against a reactionary capitalist ruling class. The very word revolutionary stems from the time of Galileo and Copernicus. The word revolutionary stems from the scientific proof that the earth was revolving around the sun. Today's relativists are akin to yesterday's defenders of an earth-centered Ptolemaic universe. Today's relativists deny that we live in a world filled with three-dimensional matter in continuous motion in the infinity of space and time. What has this panel got to do with the class struggle? Without an ideological understanding of reality, the struggle against capitalism and its ruling class cannot be victorious. To be a materialist requires understanding what matter is. The brain must lead the body. Activism without understanding reality is a losing strategy. Marxism has been proven over 150 years as the successful methodology for understanding and leading the class struggle. Dialectical materialism is the ideological basis of Marxism. Reading Marx without understanding Marx's methodology leads to failure to properly use Marxism in the class struggle. The dividing line between communism and social democracy is a thread that leads from the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the two greatest revolutions in human history, and thence to the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the greatest calamity in the history of the working class struggle to defeat capitalism. The war in the Balkans, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the NATO destruction of Libya, and the current imperialist-sponsored destruction of Syria, as well as the attacks on the labor movements from Greece to the United States, are all the result of the final bureaucratic degeneration and final overthrow of the Soviet Union. The catastrophic overthrow of the Soviet Union and the worker states in Eastern Europe and the misunderstanding on the left of the class character of the Soviet Union has negatively impacted the study of dialectical materialism. This must be corrected. Without understanding dialectical materialism, one cannot understand Marxism. Materialism is viewed by the capitalist ruling class as another name for Marxism. As such, the ruling class uses religious and idealist thinking to oppose materialist thinking. The right wing, the religious right-wing creationist attack on evolution is a primary example that most thinking people recognize as a reactionary religious attack on science. However, relativity is another attack on materialism, but is not understood as such. As I said before, the Big Bang Theory is creationism in scientific clothing. It is creation ex nihilo in new garb. With the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, the ruling class had an open field to turn back the clock on all the workers' gains all over the world that have been made since 1970, the Bolshevik Revolution. Ever since Gorbachev quickened the pace of market reforms that had been begun decades earlier, and the resultant overthrow of the Soviet Union, workers have been on the defensive all over the world. The invasion of Iraq in 1991, the same year, was a direct result of the end of the worker states from 1989 through the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 91. The coincidental date of the attack on Iraq at the same time is not an accident. The US had, on several occasions, threatened over the years to invade Iraq, but was prevented from doing so because the Soviet Union threatened to go to nuclear war. In 1991, the US saw its opportunity to invade Iraq and did it. The subsequent war in the Balkans, the invasion of Afghanistan, and Iraq for the second time, the destruction of Libya, the current destruction of Syria can directly be ascribed to the overthrow of the Soviet Union. The same goes for all the attacks on labor here in the United States and all over the world. The gains by labor worldwide were concessions won from the ruling class who feared communism during that period. That is why after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the ruling class proclaimed the end of history. It is not the end of history. It is the beginning of a new stage in the class struggle. It is vital that the new activist worker leaders and fighters in the class struggle should study the history of the Soviet Union and the ideology that created the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, regardless of all its defects, the greatest victory of the working people against the ruling class in the history of the world. That's why the world's ruling classes united to defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War. There were great triumphs in the Soviet Union and similar great mistakes. All must be studied. Without understanding and studying the history of the Soviet Union, we cannot learn how to avoid those same mistakes that were made there, nor learn what was successful there that we can use. The Soviet Union, while it existed, was the actual base of the worldwide workers' movement. That is why the ruling class gave so many concessions to the workers here and around the world while it existed, and why they're taking it back now that it doesn't exist. For instance, if the AFL-CIO were destroyed here, what would happen to the workers here? Well, in some sense, the Soviet Union was like the AFL-CIO with state power. Yes, bureaucratic, but still a workers' organization. The overthrow of the Soviet Union therefore was a disaster for workers everywhere. Throwing out the Soviet Union's remarkable history as if it were some unintelligible mistake will be like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. How and why did relativity become an instrument of the ruling class in its struggle against materialism? Until Einstein, the ether was understood to exist and was the basis for scientific experimentation. The ether was the only way to understand, for instance, how light acted as a wave. A wave, by definition, required a medium to propagate the wave. Therefore, space could not be empty. Maxwell based his equations on the existence of the ether. Michelson and Morley did their experiments based on the existence of the ether. Einstein has played games all over the place in terms of his interpretation about those, but generally speaking, tries to deny the existence of the ether. And this ends up with that light could travel through nothing. Michelson and Morley, along with Dayton Miller, the president of the American Physical Society, continued to run the original Michelson and Morley experiments, and they proved the existence of the ether, which falsified Einstein's theories, but the results have been ignored. Numerous other experiments and studies have also falsified Einstein's theories. Who was Einstein, and why has his theories survived despite being falsified repeatedly? Einstein was the head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, Germany, at the time of the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm on November 28, 1918. Einstein was a pacifist who personally opposed World War I, but also was an anti-communist. Arthur Eddington, who is the one who so-called confirmed Einstein's theory, also was a pacifist who personally opposed World War I and insisted on keeping the communications open with the German scientist Einstein during World War I. Eddington was the scientist who falsely claimed confirmation of Einstein's theory of relativity in May of 1919, 6 months after the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm. The year 1919, immediately after the overthrow of Kaiser Wilhelm, was the greatest turning point in the world's history, and the greatest turning point in the history of the class struggle ever. Armed and angry soldiers were outraged at the slaughter of World War I, and the ruling classes everywhere around the world thought it was all over for them. The leaders of this 1917 Bolshevik Revolution were just trying to hold on to power until a victorious German Revolution would come to their rescue. Germany, and Berlin in particular, was the center of that worldwide struggle. All the world's eyes from all over the world were watching Berlin, because the future of the world was being determined at that point. The workers had seized Germany. They had control when they overthrew the Kaiser, but they had no organization. There was no Communist Party. They had no organizational party to lead them. The German ruling class thought they were beaten. The Social Democratic Party, which had betrayed the workers at the beginning of the war, had lost all credibility amongst the workers. But that, because of the situation, they became the German ruling class's primary political organization against the seizure of power of the German workers. Einstein, at this critical moment in history, became a founder of the newly created German Democratic Party. At this critical moment, and in Berlin. The German Democratic Party was to the right of the Social Democratic Party, but to the left of the ultra-nationalists. The German Democratic Party was the party that wrote the Weimar Constitution. The primary financier of the German Democratic Party, Hjalmar Schacht, later became Hitler's banker as the Reichsminister of Economics before being succeeded by Hermann Goering in 1937. The German Social Democratic Party brought in the German Freikorps to put down the workers of Berlin. The Freikorps were bitter, ultra-nationalist soldiers who viewed the workers as traitors that caused Germany to lose the war. The Freikorps later became the vanguard of the Nazi movement. January 1919, just 2 months after the overthrow of the Kaiser, saw the first Battle of Berlin, where the workers were defeated. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were assassinated that month as a result. 2 months later, in March of 1919, saw the second Battle of Berlin, where the workers again were defeated by the Freikorps. 2 months later, in May 1919, came Eddington's false confirmation of the theory of relativity in May of 1919. What did this confirmation have to do with the struggle in Berlin? Vladimir Lenin was the leader of the world revolution against capitalists, the ruling classes. All the eyes were on this struggle. And Lenin was the leader. And Lenin had written a book in 1908 attacking relativity. The title of that book is Materialism and Imperial Criticism. To believe that it is just a coincidence that the worldwide ruling class battle against communism that was led by Lenin in the critical year of 1919, which struggle was centered in Berlin, and where Einstein was directly politically involved, and where relativity theory was in direct conflict with Lenin's ideology of dialectical materialism, would be to ignore reality. Relativity theory was therefore thrust forward in the ruling class's fight against communism. Relativity theory is a ruling class tool to keep our brains filled with nonsensical ideas that will keep us confused and helpless. Relativity theory is an attack on basic physical laws. Imagine that I have a ball in my hand. I drop the ball and it bounces up and down again. The basic law of physics involves that a body in motion cannot change its direction of motion unless an external force acts on it. You know what happened at the bottom when it hit the floor, right? Or hit the top of a table or whatever. You can see that. What happened at the other side? Did the ball get tired? Did a hand reach out from the floor and pull it down? No. What happened is a ball cannot change its direction on its own. It has to be impinged by matter hitting it. No such thing as action at a distance.
Gravity.
But what is gravity? You can't say you're throwing a word.
Geometry of space.
Okay, let's get that into the discussion, okay?
No, but that's true.
No, that's not.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Do you deny gravity? You're really...
No, I'm not.
One second.
Please,
One
let me
second.
finish.
Please let him finish his presentation, and all those questions will come up. Thank you.
The theory of gravity involving something called action at a distance is a violation of causality, which is the most important law of physics. Newton was not a proponent of action at a distance, as it is claimed. Action at a distance is another word for magic, not science. Newton, in regard to the idea of action at a distance, stated that this idea is, quote, so great an absurdity that I believe that no man who has in philosophical matters a competent facility of thinking can ever fall into it, unquote. And Newton also stated, quote, You sometimes speak of gravity as essential and inherent in matter. Pray do not ascribe that notion to me, for the cause of gravity is what I do not pretend to know, unquote. The second law of thermodynamics is being misused to justify bogus theories about the eventual big freeze where the universe will cool down to absolute zero. The second law only applies to a closed system, like this room. Space is not a closed system, space is infinite. The law of the conservation of matter means that matter has always been present because matter cannot be created out of nothing nor destroyed. It can only be transformed into other matter in motion. Therefore, by definition of a basic law of physics, there cannot be a beginning of time where there was no matter. Time is not a thing. It is simply how we measure the distance matter moves relative to other matter in motion. Time cannot be different for different objects in motion, as the relativists claim. To claim that time is different for different objects is to deny our ability to measure the relative motion of these different objects. Without an agreed upon universal measurement of that motion of time, no science is possible. Einstein stated, quote, "For us convinced physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is an illusion, although a persistent one." Oh, really? And you want us to believe this nonsense? That statement means that Einstein did not believe in change, that events are preordained. Isn't that a religious, not a scientific statement from Einstein? Time is not a thing. Only material objects are things. Things have a beginning and an end. Things like the chair you are sitting on can be created or destroyed. Time, space, and the universe are not things that can be perceived by any of our senses. We can locate matter in motion at physical locations in time and space and the universe, nothing more. The past is past. The future, by definition, can never be now. The future must always remain in the future. But now is just a moment we are passing through. You cannot point to now. For to do so, it would already be in the past. We move through now, but can never point to now. Only things exist. Matter in motion exists. Matter moves through the infinity of space and time. In fact, the meaning of infinity is nothing. In is no. Finite is something that can be counted. An apple, you. Therefore, it's a thing. So infinity, no thing, nothing. You cannot, for instance, where they talk about, it cooled down from an infinite temperature. Well, if I subtract 1 trillion degrees from infinite temperature, what do you have? An infinite temperature. You can't subtract, multiply, divide, or anything from infinity. It's not a number.
That's a false type. It's false.
It's not a number, please. The illusion of time and space as things created by our... the illusion of time and space as things is created by our ability to specify the location in time and space where events happen. But a location is not a thing. It is where an event occurred in space and time, nothing more. Time as the fourth dimension is a product of math, not of reality. Math can use 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 4 dimensions, or as many dimensions as you can imagine. Reality, however, exists only in 3 dimensions.
Why?
Okay.
How are you so sure?
We'll get to the discussion, please. I'm almost summing up here. Marxism-Leninism is the ideology of successful revolutions. I urge serious revolutionaries to study the history of the Bolshevik Revolution. Every subsequent successful working-class revolution based itself on the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, including China, Cuba, and Vietnam. If you think that you can make a revolution without a serious study of the past efforts at revolution, you will be making a tragic mistake that will make it that much more difficult to actually make the revolution that you so desire. Even if you are by chance momentarily able to seize power, then what? How would this most complicated society in the history of the world function under your leadership if you had no knowledge of history and of social movements and class struggle? Revolution sounds romantic, but in actuality it is a great burden that requires serious people in leadership who have discussed every possible variant and researched previous events that would give them additional knowledge. Knowledge is power. There is no better test experiment in worker power than the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. I urge you to seriously study that test. I urge you to take a dialectical materialist, not a static materialist, position on the USSR and China. The static materialist looks at a particular event, such as the changing of the word of the Constitution of the USSR from the dictatorship of the proletariat to the state of the whole people, completely out of context with the reality of the then economic structure of the Soviet Union, and proclaims that this was the moment when capitalism triumphed. Is that Marxism? No. The history of the USSR, from the seizure of power by the workers in 1917 to the physical counter-revolution and overthrow of the workers' power in 1991, was a dialectical process of ever-growing bureaucratic degeneration in the Soviet Union that started on day one of the 1917 revolution. Lenin's fight to defend the Soviet Union from imperialist and internal counter-revolution, and Lenin's simultaneous fight against the bureaucratic degeneration of the first worker state needs to be studied and understood. I urge you to read Lenin and Trotsky, the two primary leaders of the 1917 revolution. In particular, Lenin's Materialism and Imperial Criticism, and Trotsky's In Defense of Marxism. Both these books are defenses and explanations of dialectical materialism. One should also read Engels' explanation of dialectical materialism in his book Anti-Dueling. I urge you also to read three works of Sam Marcy that are critical to understanding today's world. 1, China, the Struggle Within. 2, China, the Suppression of the Left. And 3, Perestroika. As I said, the brain must lead the body. Organizing against capitalism requires understanding our dialectically changing world. This gives us, the working class, a tool, an ideological tool that is much more powerful than any ideological tool that the ruling class possesses. Finally, defense of the Soviet Union. From 1917 through 1991, defense of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, defense of what remains of workers' power in China, and defense of Syria against imperialist aggression are what separates communists from social democracy. It all comes down to the old slogan, which side are you on?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Wait, one second.
Q&A, please.
1 second, please. 1 second. Listen. Wait. Excuse me. Let's be civil to each other. For those of you who came in late, I mentioned before, we will have both presentations and then we will open for question and answers. And I understand that you're anxious to ask, and it's okay. But give us a chance for our next presenter. Okay? Glenn Borchardt, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Mike, for inviting me here. I was impressed with Mike's book. In fact, you can see my little quote on the cover. And it's very rare that I ever find someone who thinks like I do and There's a few. We have a group called the Natural Philosophy Alliance, and we have a couple hundred members in the U.S. These are folks that are opposed to the relativity and Big Bang theory. Worldwide, we have something like 7,000 people that are opposed. Now, you don't hear about this very much because you know how things go if you're working on the lab. Now, unlike most other scientific disciplines, physics and cosmology are heavily theory-laden. And in the earth sciences in which I labored for over 50 years, we don't question the assumption that there are material causes for all effects. We have our feet on the ground. And so I was shocked when I found out, wow, there's more than 3 dimensions? And in fact, the only C I ever got in college was in Physics 1A, where they talked about relativity and so forth. I just couldn't get it. And then I took 1B later on from an 83-year-old gentleman. I took this course in the summer. It was classical mechanics, got an A+. That was the difference. I just could not jump across those assumptions. And so I couldn't figure out why they were making all these proclamations, and how could they happen? Why? Why do they exist? The universe exploding out of nothing? Come on. How can there be an end to the universe? Okay, in satisfying this curiosity, I learned a few things that have led me here today. Okay, being a materialist by occupation, that's what I was doing. I was drawn to dialectical materialism, which was all rage in the 60s and 70s, and some even called it the scientific worldview. And this was certainly a different way of looking at the world than I had experienced. My dad was a big follower of Joe McCarthy. He came from Wisconsin. I was religious for 20 years, and the most conservative of religion. So, absent Marx, I had no idea that there was even a pattern to history. I thought it was all a big blur of events and so on. And what Marx was saying is, look, there's a progression here from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. I said, what? Really? No, that was interesting. So, and he talked about a spiralic process. Remember the negation of negation, one of the laws that Engels came out. Whenever there's a turn in the spiral, it doesn't go back just the way it was before, but there is an additional change. So there's a spiral to progress, and that was new to me. Anyway, this cosmology stuff just didn't make any sense to me at all. So Marx's method, of course, later called dialectical materialism, historical materialism, emphasized it was not consciousness that determined conditions, but conditions that determine consciousness. Okay, that was kind of a shock to me too, because I always thought, what is consciousness? 20th century physicists, like their compatriots in the rest of the bourgeoisie, were heavily influenced by remnants of feudalism and the most explosive phase of capitalist development. Like the still religious folk that dominate the electorate, most physicists were raised on feudalistic beliefs in creation and the soul, which is matterless motion, as far as I can tell. The paradox and contradictions wrought by relativity, and there are plenty of them, you know. There's a twin paradox, wave-particle duality. Those were accepted by these folks because if you're religious, you have a lot of contradictions to deal with. Walking on water, virgin birth, living after dying, those are little contradictions, right? So this is where these people are coming from. That's where I came from. You don't have to be an atheist to be a scientist. You may become one, but you don't have to be one. And that was no accident that the Big Bang Theory was promulgated during the greatest capitalist expansion the world has ever known. Is that just an accident? I don't know. The assumptions that underlay the idea that capitalist growth was inevitable and perpetual, and that one lived after dying, were compatible with a new physics and cosmogony. I call it, cosmogony is cosmology that assumes a beginning. Okay, with infinity, I'm an infinite universe guy, but with the Big Bang, that assumes a beginning, right? But it took the assumptions that underlay the idea that capital, but because of the fog of bourgeois propaganda, it took me quite a while to sort all this stuff out. And like I said, I was quite interested in this because I just couldn't get it. And you know about Engels' 3 laws. The first is unity and conflict of opposites. I used that. And the transformation of quantity into quality. And again, like I said, negation and negation. These were good. They were nice, but they weren't enough. Okay, and that's why these books came about. The 10 Assumptions of Science, that's where they come from. So it was surprising that the idealist philosopher Robin Collingwood said a lot of nonsense, but he did say some really good advice. He said, fundamental assumptions always have opposites, and they're not provable. And if you hold more than one, they have to be conseponable. That is, and you probably know, you've never heard this word before, unless you read my stuff, and his conseponable means that if you can hold one assumption, you can hold the other without contradiction. And those are the three criteria I use. And I said, look at every paradigm, like the Big Bang, has its foundation and its assumptions. Even Kuhn talked about that in The Structure of Scientific Revolution. Well, anyway, he had this written up in his essay on metaphysics, and I passed it up at the Berkeley Library about 3 times, because when I hear metaphysics as a scientist, bullshit, right? Well, anyway, this is some really great ideas that he brought up, and so I went ahead and I said, okay, let's see what assumptions are being made, because they're not, I don't think they're the ones that I would hold. Okay, so after a bunch of research, I came up with the 10 assumptions of science. Now you can have one assumption, you can have 1,000. I picked 10 for, I was religious. 10 was a good number. And so I divided all the philosophical propositions into 2 opposing categories, deterministic and indeterministic. Remember I said, determinism says that there are material causes for all effects. Indeterminism says, no, some effects may not have material causes. Okay? All right, so that's the foundation of all religions. Determinism just being the opposite. So I split things that way. Now, I have to disagree a little bit with Mike. He says, well, that's materialism versus idealism, and that's the standard way we would do it in dialectical materialism. I couldn't do that. As a scientist, we use idealism all the time. For example, we think like between you and I is empty space, right? And then I'm solid matter. Well, in truth, there is no empty space. That's an idea. There is no solid matter. There can't be. What there is always in between. But those idealizations are really important, because otherwise I couldn't get around this room. I got to find the empty space to get out the door, which I'll probably have to do when this gets going. So I say this, there are causes for all effects, right? And that means all effects. It means everything in your brain as well. There is no, under this belief, there is no free will, because everything must be caused. Everything has cause and effect. So one of the problems I had with Engels is that he has a nice little thing in Dialectics of Nature saying, there is free will, right? And I say, no, that's not going to do it for me. So that's why I put this whole thing in the terms of determinism. And the progression was this way, 10 assumptions in here, and then I used the 10 assumptions for the scientific worldview, which has a subtitle, Understanding the Universal Mechanism of Evolution, and I'm going to get into that. This is beyond Newton and Einstein, and I'll be getting into that when I talk about the assumptions. Let me go through those assumptions a little bit, and then some of this is going to be really hard for you to understand, because if you're on a track, say you believe that there was truly empty space, or the universe was finite, you are going to have a hard time with this, because you need to do a revolution in your own mind. Okay? If you switch from finity, which is the Big Bang, to infinity, that's a 180-degree revolution. It's not a complete revolution, because you're back where you started from. But that is really a big deal. And that's what I'm all about. I want to educate people to make that kind of change. Once you make that kind of change, you will be flip-flopping on a lot of stuff, not just on finity and infinity. Now remember, materialism is the first assumption of science. You've got to have matter first. And I state it this way, the external world exists after the observer does not. Remember I said you can't prove this. You can't prove it unless you die, in which case you're not going to be telling us about it. That's what materialism. Now, immaterialism is the belief that, like I said, that matter is not, there's other things besides matter. But what is the definition of a thing? A thing has X, Y, Z dimensions and location with respect to other things. That's what matter is. And so that's where we come off with materialism. Now, matter per se doesn't exist. Remember, we always talk about matter. There are only examples of matter. Matter is an abstraction. Remember, it's like fruit. You can't eat a fruit. The only thing you can eat is, say, an apple, an orange, a specific fruit. So that the opposite of immaterialism is that the universe is an illusion or internal perception that wouldn't exist without a perceiving being. A little bit like Einstein, right? Humans often behave in ways that reflect immaterial beliefs. For example, infants sometimes cover their heads with blankets and they make the rest of the world disappear. And adults have doubts about whether that tree falling in the woods really made a noise or not. And modern physicists often follow Einstein in claiming that gravity nonetheless is caused by an immaterial field. This field is mathematical. It's got no matter in it. It's immaterial. No matter. How can that work? And gravity is still a mystery to most people. Nonetheless, the widespread belief in materialism has led to the formal use of observation and experiment as the arbiters of truth, not only in science but also in the legal system and as well in secular society. My analysis assumes the universe operates materially regardless of our ability to detect anything at all. And the most important observation any scientist ever made was Newton's first law, which says that an object in motion stays in motion, right, like you were talking, unless it's acted on by another object. Now that's just, for that, you're not talking about causality at all. All you're talking about is the motion, the inertia of the object. The second assumption of science actually gives motion to matter, and that's causality, like Mike was saying. And I have a little bit of a different take on it. Classical mechanics believed in finite causality. So there were always a finite number of causes to produce an effect. And the big problem with that is it didn't work. It worked partly, but it didn't work perfectly. So I have proposed that causality is this, to be written this way: all effects have an infinite number of material causes. You see, this fits in with the possibility of ether, an infinite subdivision of matter. And that's why we always get a plus or minus on every analysis we do. I used to do a lot of lab work, and I would try to control my system. I always got a plus or minus. Why was that? Because there were an infinite number of causes involved. It wasn't just maybe ether, it could be the temperature, this and that, and so forth, but you never had a finite number. Nobody's ever had any analysis without a plus or minus. The third assumption in science is uncertainty. Now this is compatible with this form of causality. Uncertainty, as I stated, it is impossible to know everything about anything, but it's always possible to know more about anything. You see how that fits with the infinity. It's compatible. So you can study anything, this book, and I can find out more and more about it. There's no end to it. If you study soils like I did, you put it under a microscope, and there's all kinds of stuff there. And then you bring up the and it's more and more and more. And this is really, really important interpretation. Now, the current interpretation is called the Copenhagen view, which is sort of the opposite. And it says that uncertainty is objective. And again, they're trying to save the classical mechanics of Laplace's demon. Laplace's demon was supposedly able to predict the future perfectly. It's not going to happen. Why? Because it's infinite. And it never did. The demon would have to spend all his time just doing one prediction if he wanted to get it perfectly, so he could predict the future completely. You're not going to do it. And uncertainty is often associated with the concept of randomness or chance. And there's three ways of viewing chance. One is as a sign of acausality, another as a singular cause, and also, like I said, as a sign of observer ignorance. And that's the one we picked. The others, you can, and the indeterminists will believe those sorts of things, but I don't. The fourth assumption is inseparability. Now, this is what was lost with relativity. This is Hegel's dictum. It says that just as there is no motion without matter, so there is no matter without motion. Doesn't that make sense? Well, let's keep it that way. Our discussion will all be involved with stuff that's in motion. None of this matterless motion stuff. It's a little bit hard, though, for people to understand. Because to understand it, you have to realize that there is no connection between motion and matter. You know what a connection is? Here's a connection between these two books. There is no connection. It's what matter does. Now, the physicists in the room will not know what time is. The propaganda in regard to relativity says that time is a dimension, a measurement, whatever. Time is motion. That's what I liked about Mike's stuff. Time is motion, and the average person doesn't even have a clue, and certainly not a modern physicist, because you are taught. That's what they were trying to teach me. It didn't work. They were trying to teach me that time was, like I say, a measurement, whatever. It's not. It's motion. That's all it is. It doesn't exist. It's not part of the universe. It's what parts of the universe do. This is very difficult for people to understand. I realize that. But see, conceptually, you have to separate matter and motion so that you can understand how they work. That's what you have to do. Now, there are a couple of mistakes you can make with regard to interconnection, or with inseparability. One is that matter could exist without motion. And we dispelled that with the plate tectonic theory, right? Got that going. That motion could occur without matter. Well, we didn't quite get rid of that one because this is what you're talking about with a little bit of Einstein stuff. And that matter is motion. Again, it's not true. And that motion is matter. Those are some of the mistakes that are made. One of the main errors that Einstein had was what I call his main philosophical error, and that's the objectification of motion. Objectification of motion is when you consider motion to be a thing. Like we all say, we have things to do. No, you don't. What you have is activities to do. We don't have to think, but we do that all the time. We say, we have saved enough time for you. And if anybody thinks that time is matter like that, please give me some because I'm needing it for my next book. He objectified time, Einstein objectified time in special relativity as length. He objectified light as matter. And like Mike was saying, I agree that light is not matter, it is the motion of matter. You have to have a medium for that. It's like sound. Sound is what? Is sound matter? If Einstein was doing the work, he'd call the little things that I'm putting out sound-ons, like he called the photon in light. But that's not what sound is. Sound is the motion, the vibration of air or anything else. There's a couple other things. The association between matter and motion appears in many laws of physics. And for shorthand, we use laws like momentum, for example, which is P equals mv, mass times velocity. Now, does momentum exist? Think about it. Mass times velocity.
Yes, it does. Yes.
It does not exist.
Yes, it
And
does.
what exists is the matter.
Right.
So when
And
I
the
get
product exists.
when I get hit,
Yes, momentum.
when I get hit by the tackle playing football, I got hit by the tackle. I didn't get hit by any momentum. But if I want to know how big a hit that is, I got to know he's 300 pounds and how fast he's moving, right? So that's all it is. But it's a shorthand. It's a calculation. And the same thing is true for force. Force is ma, mass times acceleration. Force doesn't exist. Right now, the physicists are arguing about the four forces. What they're talking about is different kinds of motion of matter. That's all they're doing. Energy is the same thing. What is energy? E equals mc squared. M, the mass part, c, the motion part. So what we have here is a matter-motion term. It's a hyphenated. Matter-motion terms are used all the time in physics. But we forget what we're doing with them. we sort of like this. It's matter exists and motion occurs. These equations are like pictures of the running dog. They're not the running dog. There's a difference. That's what we have to know if we're going to do any kind of analysis of what's going on here. Conservation is matter, and the motion of matter can be neither created nor destroyed. Notice I didn't put energy in it because energy doesn't exist, but matter does, and the motion occurs. All right? So that's conservation. Now the opposite, of course, is creation. And that's what's being assumed in cosmogonies. You're creating something from nothing, and that's the opposite. So remember, there's always an opposite to each of these assumptions that I use. That's how my analysis proceeded. Now, the sixth assumption of science is complementarity. And you all heard of second law of thermodynamics, or should have by now. Remember, that's one that predicts the heat death of the universe. And the way I interpret it is this. Complementarity says that all bodies are subject to divergence and convergence from other bodies. That only works in an infinite universe. One reason they're using the second law because they have a finite universe. They have used systems philosophy, which is the current bourgeois philosophy of science, as the archetype of all of systems. Here you make the whole universe the thing. Remember, in science, what we do is we do systems philosophy. We draw a sphere around whatever we're studying. It. We get all the data and stuff, and then we make grand pronouncements about stuff. And that's typical error of systems philosophy. So complementarity is what I call this. Essentially is it says that, remember, the indeterminists will say that there's only the second law and no complement to it. I tried to get this published back in 1980 in Science. They didn't like it. I think I've got 2 papers rejected out of about 300, and that was one of them. But of course, it's controversial, and you get the right editor, and you don't get through. So this is the yin and yang above the whole universe. Things are always coming apart, like your house does if you don't attend to it, and things are coming together in another place. So anything that comes off of here, falls off your house, ends up in the ground. Now this is why it was always curious to me why the universe is supposed to be from a big bang. Now if you create something, you make something, how do you do it? There's a convergence. You get the hammer, you want to build a house, hammer, nails, plaster, cement. You bring things together. You don't bring them apart. This is silly. I mean, that's it. But people believe in the Big Bang all over the place. The explosion of something out of nothing.
What if you're digging a hole?
But we'll do it. I've done that too, and I was making it. Okay, the seventh assumption of science is irreversibility. All processes are irreversible. That is, it's impossible to go back in time. Sorry for you guys that wanted to do that. And I think, like Mike was saying, those former periods don't exist. The future doesn't exist. But I was at this one meeting where this fellow was a believer in Einstein, and he swore that the occasion of my birth existed, but I didn't. I didn't hang around with him much more. Now the eighth assumption of science is infinity, and I bring this up a little bit later because remember we have to start out with certain things like materialism first, causality, so on. But what I say here is the universe is infinite both in the microcosmic and macrocosmic directions. And without infinity, the 10 assumptions wouldn't exist. Remember, they're all conceptual. You try to do your own set of assumptions, good luck. Unless you include infinity, it isn't going to work. Of course, various thinkers have had 2 different types of infinity. One, Aristotle thought that everything was infinitely subdividable, and but the macro was not. And then Newton had just the opposite. Remember, Newton's object was solid. Solid matter, there's nothing in it. That was one of the problems. Like all the atomists, remember they had a little atoms going around, they're all identical, they're all solid. Why would they even join up at all? There's nothing there to do that. But anyway, that's what infinity is all about. So I use both that it's microcosmic infinite and macrocosmic infinite. That's kind of about how this book came about. A universal cycle theory I wrote with Steve Pitts. He's a genius in statistics and math. And he essentially, and I, worked out what we call the neo-mechanics of the hierarchically infinite universe. And as you know, atoms are little vortices, and the solar system's a vortex, things spinning around things. And then there's the Milky Way galaxy does that, and then there are galactic clusters that do that. And now we're finding that there's a general drift of clusters in one direction. So we have hypothesized in this thing a megavortex, a local megavortex. This is our observable universe right here. This is going around the neck. Some people have called this the great attractor or whatever. And we have some ideas in here about gravitation. While we were working on this book, I think we came up with, we thought it was a really great idea. It essentially, it has ether pressure is greater away from massive objects than near them because of the interaction of ether and matter. And then we looked into optics. Newton's book, a fellow finally mentioned it. The same idea was in there. And you mentioned about Newton's idea or attraction or something like that. That's the one they push. But they don't push what he actually came up with, came very, very close to what gravity really is. And so if you're interested in this kind of stuff, get this book. It's only $60. Yeah, but you can get it from Kindle for $10. So people have done that. Yeah. Let me kick along here a little bit. The ninth assumption of science is relativism. Now let's think about this one. All things have characteristics that make them similar to other things, as well as characteristics that make them dissimilar to other things. Now, absolutists don't believe that. They believe in absolute identities. This is common in things, like Plato or whatever, ideal forms and so forth, as actually being existing. Relativism says that. The 10th assumption of science is interconnection. All things are interconnected, and what I say is that between any two objects exist other objects that transmit matter and motion. You see how that fits with infinity? Subdividable and so on. We use that to good effect in here. Because this guy came up to me, and I actually got a hold of him. He has all these cycles that are applicable, and he's trying to figure out, make sense of them. Why do they relate to each other as well as they do? And that's what we did. And interconnection was it. So he has cycles from a billion years to days. Okay, now I'm going to wrap this up with what my philosophy is. It's called univironmental determinism. Now you remember I had mentioned the Marx quote saying that it isn't consciousness that determine conditions, but conditions that determine consciousness. And that's sort of like environmental determinism. It's sort of like an overemphasis on the conditions and less emphasis on consciousness. Now I'm sure many people have changed that for political reasons. But remember that the current scientific worldview is systems philosophy, and it replaced classical mechanics. The first, which was the first worldview, scientific worldview. Systems philosophy tends to overemphasize the insides of things, and classical mechanics tends to overemphasize the outsides of things. So here's Marx doing the same thing. Remember what Darwin came up with, natural selection. He was emphasizing the outsides of his model, his subject. And of course this was changed, because once they found genes, they had to include the insides of the model. And so now we have the mechanism of evolution is neo-Darwinism. It is the combination of these two. The only problem with that, for me, being a soil scientist, earth scientist, I see evolution all the time. I work on the evolution of soils. I'm supposed to know whether a soil's 11,000 years old or 20 or 50. So I said, look, we need a mechanism that's not just neo-Darwin, only works in biology. We need a mechanism for evolution that is useful in everything. And that's why I came up with this word univironmental with my friend Elizabeth. Remember I said environmental determinism was the verge of what Marx was saying there. Univironment is the combination of the system, thing, and its environment. See why I need an infinite universe? Whatever happens, this is what it says. Univironmental determinism says, whatever happens to a portion of the universe is determined by the matter in motion, the infinite matter in motion inside it, and the infinite matter in motion outside. And there are all kinds of infinities, so don't go off on that one. That's what univironmental determinism is. You can analyze any portion of the universe that way, and you will be correct, except you have two problems. One is you may overemphasize the microcosmic, which I call a microcosmic mistake, or you might overemphasize the macrocosmic, and that's a macrocosmic mistake. So in science, what we try to do, not make mistakes, because as a scientist, they don't like to pay you for making a mistake. So you always have to get this proper balance. And I think that's what we need to do in social movements as well. Let's see. So anyway, let me get to the quick here, wrap this up. So how does this help us understand regressive physics? And I call this regressive physics, because we're talking a step back, away from materialism, to what Einstein and the Big Bang theorists are doing. Well, it should be pretty clear by now that physicists work in a particular environment that has a tremendous effect on their consciousness. If you were brought up with indeterministic assumption of creation, you might not object to cosmogony, the assumption that the universe was finite and had a beginning. If you believed in the Holy Ghost and in souls, you might not object to other physicists' claims of matterless motion. If you believed in absolutes of any sort, you might believe in the constancy of the speed of light, which is now being questioned. I guess you probably have heard about that. That'll go back and get it constant again, but that's one example. There are no constants in it. There are no constants in nature. We have a whole chapter on that in here. There are no constants, period. Everything is relative. That's the only thing we agree on with Einstein. Everything is in motion with respect to everything else. Universal time is the motion of everything with respect to everything else. Specific time is always measured by a clock. So if I have a clock that's here or an hourglass, I can measure that specific time. But like I said, universal time is there. You can't measure universal time. Okay, at the Progressive Science Institute, we have produced a detailed critique of today's regressive physics. That little card I handed out has the scientificphilosophy.com website, and I encourage you to take a look at that, and you'll get some idea of what's going on. I'll have to just state these 9 claims here, or whatever, and then you'll have to decide whether they fit your cup of tea or not. The universe, first of all, point number 1, the universe did not explode out of nothing. The universe is not expanding. The redshift is the result of wave motion of light over distance. And nothing travels for far without something happening to it. I don't know what's happening to light, but it ain't getting there. It's being redshifted every time. The universe will not die. Heat death is claimed by any deterministic interpretation of the second law from their finite assumption. Gravitation is a push, not a pull. That's what Mike was saying, and I thought, well, that's pretty good. And in this book, that's exactly what we come up with. Momentum, force, and energy do not exist. They are calculation. Time is motion. There is an ether from which ordinary matter has form. We could talk about that more if you want. There is no wave-particle duality. Light is wave motion in the ether. The claims of regressive physics are integral to the bamboozlement of the populace. It's part of the whole damn thing. And we're all fighting it. We have to have a revolution in our minds as well. And my idea of a revolution that stays is one in which everybody is on the same page. Everybody understands the same stuff. Right now, that's not happening. There's so much confusion. Even the physicists don't know what they're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.